Okay, so I am Jesse Vitao, the Vice President of the SFUAMB, and I will be the host and moderator for the panel discussion. I already went over the disruption policy, so I would like to ask Phil to come up and talk about our sponsor.
Thanks, Jesse. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming out tonight. I am super excited about today's presentation. But before I give a brief description of the charity I represent and the one sponsoring today's event, I want to take a brief moment to recognize the hard work that goes on behind the scenes that made this event possible today. The student team behind the SFUMB is incredible. They're the people with the purple tags, by the way, hanging around their necks. Despite all of their schooling, the heavy course loads, assignments, and exams, they have consistently made time to grow this club, organize these events, and strategize how best to advocate for issues affecting men and boys on SFU campus and in Vancouver's greater community. So, and this is all volunteer work, I just want to let you guys know. So please join me in thanking them with a big round of applause. So my name, again, is Phil Johnston. I'm the president of the Vancouver chapter of the Canadian Association for Equality, or CAFE. Some of you may have heard of it before. CAFE is a registered educational charity that's been active for about 4 years, and it's based in Toronto. Our focus is on gender equality, and at present, the particular inequities that men and boys face in society. What are some of those inequities? Well, these include the lack of resources for male victims of intimate partner violence, high suicide rates, the underachievement of boys in education, circumcision, and many, many more. Our advocacy work consists of advertising campaigns and sponsoring events such as this one on university campuses. And CAFE Vancouver has plans to set up similar clubs at other universities here in British Columbia. CAFE National has branches in nearly every major Canadian city, now including Toronto, Montreal, Calgary, and Edmonton. So one of CAFE's biggest successes was setting up the Canadian Centre for Men and Families, and that started in Toronto. And this is really significant for many reasons, because it's really the first center of its kind. It's an all-purpose hub for the health and welfare of boys, men, fathers, and families in the GTA, in the Toronto area. But we at Vancouver here, we really want to set up one of these centers, and we're going to do that here in Vancouver. And sponsoring the SFUMB and other future university clubs will be an important first step towards doing that. So to get there, though, we need help from people like yourselves. So near the end of the event, we'll be handing out this donation jar here. Any donations you can contribute are really appreciated, and it will help us support our mission of men's advocacy here in Vancouver. There's also, we're going to be handing out a feedback form. There's a new option on there to donate online if you'd like us to follow up with you about that. Funds will go directly to the SFUMB and other local initiatives, helping us continue events like this, expand into other forms of activism, and organize more significant fundraising efforts. So, and if you'd like to get involved as a volunteer, just approach myself or Theryn, who will be on the panel today. So thank you for your kind attention, and I will pass it back to Jesse.
Okay, so our schedule is reversed. I mentioned that earlier. We're going to have the panel discussion starting now. If you want to ask questions, we have a mic. And if you would like to ask questions anonymously, we do have an Ask FM, which is ask.fm/SFUAMB. For our listeners on the live stream, you can tweet questions to @SFUAMB with the hashtag SheForHe. Okay, so I'd like to call up, introduce our panelists for today. So I think most of you know Karen. She's the founding member of the Honey Badgers. She's been interviewed on numerous TV stations and to various presentations like newspapers. She's been used as an example of men's rights activism in gender studies courses across Canada as well. Our second Honey Badger here today is Hannah Wallen, author of Breaking the Glasses. And aside from being a founding member of HBR and the managing editor, she's also written for Gender Radic and A Voice for Men. And our final panelist today is Theryn, SFUAMB's president, who has been a contributor to HBR and has also actually been used as examples of MRA activism in gender studies classes across Canada. So I'd like to call them up and take a seat at our panel table.
I'm just going to hog the mic.
I'd just like to say that we decided today that I was going to be a panelist because of Alison and some complications. She was supposed to be a panelist. So I guess I'm a good second.
We're stuck with her.
My apologies.
Is there anything you guys would like to say to start off the panel, or should we jump right into some of the questions we have prepared?
I think we should just jump right in.
Okay. So I guess with the theme of the event, SheForHe, do you feel that it's easier for women to speak up about men's issues, and if so, why? Do you see the success of MIA? I don't know what that one is.
Men's issues.
Men's Issues okay, yeah. Men's Issues Advocacy, directly linked to community's ability to increase the number of women in its ranks.
Anybody else want to go first?
You go first.
Okay, it's definitely easier to do this as a woman than it is to do it as a man. I don't know how many men have emailed me and said, I was just surfing YouTube one night, I stumbled across one of your videos. If you had been, and I was even mad when I was listening to it for the first bit. And if you were a guy, I would have just clicked away. I would not have stayed and listened to the whole thing. And after I'd listened to the whole thing, I was like, she's got a point. And then I went looking for more information. And that's just from men. Women tend to... Tom Golden, he's a psychologist, clinical psychologist. He's been studying men's psychology, particularly how they grieve and how they heal, for decades. And he's written some very good books. And I would recommend them to anybody. But he said that he'd been working with someone who worked with the homeless, and this man had said something that just really struck him. When a man admits that he needs help, he forfeits his right to it. There seems to be a genuine inability for people to actually look at a man who is asking for help, or look at a man who's telling you that he's suffering, particularly if he's suffering as a man. If he's got cancer, he got hit by a car, or something like that. But when it comes to problems that can be labeled specifically masculine problems or predominantly masculine problems, and they come to you and say, I'm suffering, that a wall comes down. Nobody wants to hear it, and nobody wants to help. And so when that's the reaction from even most men, it really does take a woman to sort of be able to say it in such a way that it doesn't put people off, it doesn't get them angry, it doesn't make them feel threatened. Particularly if a man is acting out in any kind of way that could possibly be construed as aggressive, he's going to be taken the wrong way. Men's rights activists have a reputation, an unearned reputation, as doing things like promoting violence against women and using violent rhetoric and inciting violence, and even we've even been called terrorists. None of those things are true, but they're very easy for people to believe, because it's very easy to believe there's a group of angry men out there who just hate women, and that's the only reason they could be talking about these things, is just because they hate women and they're angry and they're bitter and they don't deserve our sympathy. So when a woman is actually saying these things, it's a little harder for people to dismiss it as just angry, bitter men, and that's probably the biggest reason why women need to be very, very involved in all of this, particularly just in the awareness spreading area of things. So I don't know if you have anything to add?
Yeah. There's also the aspect of it can make something more relatable to women, as in society is more interested in approaching problems and dealing with problems based on how they affect women than based on how they affect men.
Or children.
Or even children, yeah. Women get the long end of the stick when it comes to this. And a lot of times, if you're able to discuss how it harms women to be facilitated in dysfunctional behavior, because the law is geared toward helping them without taking into account that there are dysfunctional behaviors that can accompany certain situations like domestic violence. As soon as you are able to start talking about ways that women can be damaged by that facilitated dysfunction, it opens up a door for people to start to understand better the way those situations can be harmful to the family and can be harmful to the community and so on. They don't necessarily notice that if it's just harmful to the man involved who's accused of being violent. It takes women pointing out that when a woman acts out violently, it's still violence, that hitting somebody doesn't become a nonviolent act because a woman was angry about something somebody did. When a man says it, he's being a wimp. When a woman says it, she's acknowledging the fact that when women take an action, it's still an action, and that we're responsible for what we do. So it takes that female voice to get people to sort of understand and accept when we talk about women that we're not demonizing women. We're actually promoting an understanding of women, and we're actually treating women like adults.
Yeah, and I just have a last thing to add. Just from my observations, I think that the collective voice of women has a lot of power, a lot more power than the collective voice of men. Now, individual men can have, the voice of an individual man can have a lot more power than any woman, depending on his status, like say a male CEO obviously has a lot more, his voice has a lot more power than many women. But the collective voice of women, when they say we need this, society needs to change because it's harming us in this way, we are generally quite responsive because the collective voice of women has quite a bit of power. Yeah, that's all I wanted to say. So yeah, that's why I think it's important.
I want to add something to that too, because the collective voice of women versus the collective voice of men. I think that men can have a collective voice on a whole host of issues, whether it's politics or the economy or rooting for a sports team even. But when it comes to themselves and sort of their position as men, I think it's extremely hard for men to speak collectively. I think that it may be some sort of psychological block. It has to do, it's been demonstrated that when, that women have, if you hold all other variables equal, women have an automatic preference for women as sort of an abstract concept. Men have an automatic out-group preference. So they have stronger feelings of affiliation, stronger positive feelings towards women than they do towards men. And I think that this really interferes with men's ability to kind of group together on issues that affect them in particular as men and sort of speak with one voice. I think that there will always be this this difference in how women can collectivize their point of view, at least in the short term, to get a job done. And you can see this with, what was it, when Canada adopted the Swedish model for prostitution. That push, that lobbying effort, it created some very strange bedfellows. Feminist groups and Christian conservatives. Feminist women and Christian conservative women came together in the short term in order to get this bill in front of Parliament. And so we don't seem to have, men don't seem to have that ability to just sort of come together even in the short term to accomplish a goal. They seem to be more liable to side with women, to favor women's points of view. So, yeah.
That actually nicely dovetails into another question about whether one of the ways that women in the movement can help the movement is to get people to pay attention to men talking about their own issues as opposed to simply just talking about those issues. How would you say about that?
Could you repeat that?
Oh, yeah, that another way that women in the men's rights movement can prove the movement is by convincing people to listen to men talking about their own issues as opposed to just talking about the issues themselves.
That's actually an experience I've seen sort of firsthand writing with a voice for men. I can point out articles written by men on a voice for men, and people will read them, that would not read them if they hadn't been pointed to by a woman. They would automatically dismiss the article and its contents without ever looking at it if they got the link just by chance or if they got the link from a man, because it's got a man's name and it's about a man's issue. But as soon as a woman points that out to him and says, this is a description of one of the problems, or this is a man's point of view on an experience that he's had because of these issues, or this is research that explains a bit about this issue, or anything, it's legitimized it for these people, that would not necessarily read it otherwise. It's like giving them permission to treat it as somebody's experiences or somebody's research or somebody's thoughts on the subject, rather than to treat it as something that the enemy handed out, or as whining, or depending on what walk of life they come from. I mean, gender issues advocates that consider themselves to be on the other side of the fence will actually consider things that are written by men from an organization that they have called names because a woman gave them the link. So it makes a big difference. It's a big responsibility, and it's also a real privilege to be able to help some of those voices be heard.
I just wanted to say that anyone who came up through the mythopoetic men's movement would be able to tell you, if 20 men are beating drums in a circle in the forest, will anybody hear them? No. Okay, it really isn't enough for men to get to, I mean, it's a valuable thing for men to get together and talk about their problems and kind of work it out in themselves. And sometimes what I've noticed is that it's not like when people stumble across my material, they feel like full of hope, right? For, positive change and progress and all of this, right? Because I take a very cynical view of the doability of a great deal of what we're actually trying to accomplish here. I'm a pessimist in terms of how much is actually going to end up getting done or changing. But they do tend to express to me that when they could actually attribute what the problem was, and it's kind of like that show, that Medical Mysteries show or whatever, where even when the person finds out after the 10 years of, all of these undiagnosed crazy symptoms, and they find out after 10 years, they finally find out they're going to die, right? But at least they know why, right? And that always seems to give them some sort of closure or some sort of feeling of things settling down inside. They're not as angry anymore. Maybe they're more determined instead to make a difference. But I have heard so many men say to me, it's not really that I have any hope, it's just that at least I know what's going on, and I'm not in the dark. I'm not wandering around confused, being poked and prodded by the culture without even knowing why, right? And so I think that can really help, and I think that those, sort of the drum circles in the woods can help for certain types of men who might be into that kind of thing. It really does help to actually be able to talk about these things. But unless the issues, if the issues are just in drum circles in the woods, if they're not on the table, right, or on the agenda, then that's really not going to accomplish a whole lot to actually make material improvements in people's lives. They have to actually be addressed on more than just an intellectual or a psychological level or an individual level. They actually have to be addressed at a policy level, a legislative level, at the level of the broader culture. So, it's very important that women are in the movement to kind of force the issues into the public discourse, because they aren't going to get solved in a drum circle in the woods.
So you mentioned that you're a bit of a cynic with respect to succeeding in these goals. What kind of timeline do you see for achieving some of the goals of the men's movement, and what goals do you think are just unachievable in our for humans?
Okay, I won't presume to put a timeline on things. I will say that sexism is never going to go away. I firmly believe this. I do not believe that we are ever going to have as positive feelings of affiliation for men on average, all other things being held constant in the abstract sense as we will about women. I think that there are too many biological factors involved, even including what we look like. You know, how we differ in our appearance, everything, right? So I don't think that actual equality across the board, including things like gender sentencing gap, stuff like that, I don't think that's ever going to become a reality. What I'm looking at is how close to equality can we actually manage to get, right? And can we bring some of that women are wonderful effect down? Because, you know, some women are wonderful, other women are pretty horrendous. Just like some men are wonderful and some men are, you know who you are, pretty horrendous. No, you're a sweetie. But yeah, no, it's so I think that we can equalize things to a point. We're never going to get all the way to 100% equality, equal treatment, socially, culturally, the whole bit. Politically, legislatively, it's not going to happen. But we can improve things, and we can improve them quite drastically just through essentially doing what we're doing now. And this is part of that, right? So,
Yeah, I think things can get a whole lot better from where we are now. And I guess I'm a little bit more optimistic. I do believe that, like, for example, legislative changes can happen, at least on paper. How much it affects people's biases in the court system, for example. It'll mitigate that somewhat. I agree with you that it won't ever totally go away. But getting those changes on paper, getting, you know, legislation passed that would ensure that just in general men get treated equally where there are biases when it comes to the sentencing gap, when it comes to the family court system. I do think those can be implemented, at least in some material way.
well, it's getting them to admit it too, that there is a problem.
Exactly.
I also, I have one thing on this, and that is that not all change is going to be legislative. There's a great deal of social change that needs to take place. And rather than using like criminal court as my example, I'm going to go into divorce court, because that was my primary experience, set of experiences, I should say, that led me into the movement. And a great deal of the problem with divorce court is in the fact that when you break up a relationship, it is almost impossible to do so without animosity between the people breaking up. And so you have that issue of the child being used, you know, as a weapon against the other parent, the tug of war situation, and so on. And it does help. This also goes back into the women's voices thing as well. It does help for mothers to acknowledge that it is very important to keep the father in the child's life. And it's important for fathers to acknowledge that being important to the child's life doesn't mean that the mother's not important too. And when you're in a situation where there's a war basically between the parents and the court system favors one side, you end up with a social attitude where no matter what, the other parent is the enemy. And the discussions that take place around this movement, while we are, you know, we do have as a goal for the court system to take a more functional approach to custody, there is also that need to change social attitudes, and in particular change individual attitudes during divorce, so that the parents' focus becomes how do we maintain normalcy for the child, not how do I get what I want in spite of what he wants or in spite of what she wants. how do we work together needs to be the most important thing in order to sort of maintain the best situation for the children and a healthier situation for the parents as well. Because everybody talks about the damage that that battle does to the kids. Most people don't think about the fact that you're pushing yourself closer to a stroke or a heart attack or some other early death due to stress every time you engage in a war with your ex-spouse over your child. And I've watched, among my friends and family, people in my generation go through these battles and develop significant health problems that have occurred due to stress and due to life changes they've made due to that stress, that all stems from battling with the other parent over rights that they should be cooperating to achieve a balance in.
I wanted to add as well, because Hannah's right, legislative change is not enough. Just recently in Florida, I don't know if any of you know this, Governor Scott was yet again convinced to veto alimony and custody reform legislation that had 70+% public approval and had passed both houses with overwhelming bipartisan support. And the National Organization for Women and several other women's groups, feminist groups, lobbied hard for the week that he had in order to decide whether to sign or veto the bill. They managed to convince him yet again. They did this in 2013. They did this again just a month or two ago. That it would make women and children vulnerable to abusive fathers and ex-husbands and all of the same old rhetoric, demonization of men, blah, 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 blah. It would leave women in the street, women with their children in the street, because it would mean that lifetime alimony would no longer be a thing. There are men in Florida who cannot retire, who will never be able to retire because they are paying alimony for the rest of their lives over a marriage that only lasted 6-7 years. Sometimes didn't even have kids involved, right? So this bill had overwhelming public support. It's very, very rare that you get a politician who has a public approval rating of over 40%, right? This bill had over 70% public approval. And feminist groups convinced the governor to corrupt and subvert their democracy and veto it against the will of the people. Now, this is why social attitudes need to change, because a decision like that, the only reason Governor Scott can make a decision like that is because he knows that it will not mean political death for him, right? The public's attitudes, society's attitudes need to change so that when somebody pulls a bullshit move like that, right, they don't have a hope in hell of ever getting reelected. That is what needs to happen with society, with the culture, with the public. There needs to be an attitude that we're not going to tolerate this kind of thing anymore, right? So, there you go.
I want to point out some things about that bill. It wasn't simply that they demonized fathers, they also mischaracterized the bill.
Yeah.
And this has been a repeated thing. This particular formula has been put forth repeatedly. And every time it's put forth, it is the same structure. The bill basically makes the default if there is no contest in the divorce. So nobody's saying, I want to do something else. And no situation in which the judge has said something else needs to happen, that it would be 50-50 custody. And feminists characterize it as an enforced 50-50 custody in all situations regardless in order to torpedo it. So they basically have to flat out lie about what's under discussion in order to get their way. And they've done the same thing, when they do demonize fathers like that. They are basically generalizing what happens with some parents of both sexes onto all men and only men. There are abusive mothers. Statistics from the United States government actually show that the majority of parents who abuse are mothers. And that's been reducing over the last 12 years or so, but paternal custody has been increasing over the last 12 years or so. and child abuse has gone down. So this tells us that it is not strictly a male behavior. The fact that it is not all women tells us it's not strictly a female behavior. It's a dysfunctional behavior that happens in both sexes. So it's a lie to say that this is going to endanger children by placing them with abusive fathers, when the current dynamic is the mother is almost always favored in court, and the majority of abusers are mothers.
You mentioned divorce courts as your impetus for getting involved. Would you like to expand on, I think there was a specific case mentioned in your bio that really...
Yeah, the case that really got me the most involved, that was not my family situation, although I'm married to a divorced man, so I'm a second wife. So I've seen some of the issues with the child support system and the ability to really screw up a man's life, even if he doesn't quit his job, if he just gets fired. But what really made it hit home that something had to be done was a 7-year ordeal that a friend of mine went through, and I don't even know how many years it's been. Another friend of mine is still going through an ordeal of use of false accusations of domestic violence and intimate partner and sexual violence as a weapon in custody court. And this isn't a he said, she said situation where I'm just siding with the guy. I watched a court tolerate provable perjury in a woman. I watched a court not only tolerate provable perjury, but violent outbursts in the courtroom and complete refusal to follow a judge's orders because she had claimed domestic violence. This was a divorce in which the estranged couple was no longer living together, in which the accuser would claim that the man had done something on a certain time, on a certain day, at a certain location, and lo and behold, he would have physical evidence of his presence and activities in another location at that time. And never once was there any inkling of prosecuting this woman for perjury. Never once was she held accountable for filing false charges. Never once was she held accountable when she stalked him. She was actually stalking members of his family and assaulted a family pet. His sister and niece had to take out a restraining order against her. When she violated it, the local police refused to enforce the restraining order because it was a domestic case, and a local domestic violence victims advocacy group was backing her. So this situation was so convoluted and so strange. Like, I've described it as feeling like you fell down the rabbit hole and hit every bump on the way down. I watched him go through about 4 years of not being allowed to be alone. The only way that he could protect against being thrown in jail and falsely convicted was to document everything he did and have reliable witnesses. He had to have witnesses that when they came into court, the court wasn't going to look down their nose at him and say, well, we don't have to believe this person because this person is low class. We don't have to believe this person because this person has a conviction in their background. We don't have to believe this person because this person has, the other side is able to say, this person's had to go to rehab for alcoholism or drugs. You'd have people that their character would hold up in court because his character didn't matter, his history didn't matter, his lack of criminal conviction in any area didn't matter, the fact that he came from a good family didn't matter, the fact that you could prove she was lying didn't matter. All that mattered was that a woman was accusing a man of violent acts against her. And this has become a common thing. It's so common that his attorney actually wrote about it to the local newspaper. And his ex tried to use that in court and actually attempted to have her disbarred for violating attorney-client privilege, for talking about the problem without directly mentioning any of her clients. So that's kind of what got me started in this, was trying to spread awareness of that phenomenon where the imbalance in today's domestic violence federal law in the United States has become a tool that can be exploited by unscrupulous women, by women who are not, their goal isn't necessarily to do the best thing for their children. They just want to beat their husband and their ex-husband, their soon-to-be ex-husband, in a case. You know, and this was, he got custody and she started making false accusations. There were no accusations before he got custody. And what's really caused this is a change that took place in the 90s. Prior to the 90s, there was a domestic violence law in the United States. Nobody really talks about it. It's not something that most people are aware of. And I'm not sure I can remember the exact, it was the Family Violence, there's like a set of initials, but it's basically the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act, I believe, of 1984. Ronald Reagan signed it into law. And it provided for shelters. It provided for a police response. It provided for training to help law enforcement understand that just because violence is taking place within a family doesn't make it any less an assault, and it doesn't make their response any less important. But feminists came in throughout the 70s and 80s in the United States and pushed and pushed and pushed for domestic violence law to be gendered. And they won changes in the Violence Against Women Act that took protection away from men, that took protection away from boys over the age of 13 who were victims of domestic violence, that created training that was basically believe the woman no matter what, for police departments, for every level at the court, for the prosecuting attorneys, for the state attorney generals. They all go through training that is funded by this act. And then it also funds research done at shelters that now only accept women. So it's now a self-perpetuating cycle. Look, we see all of this only happening to women, so therefore it doesn't happen to men. Well, if you don't let men in and you don't look at what happens to men, of course you're not going to get any data on men's experiences. And that problem has created an environment in which women are actually facilitated in engaging in criminal acts. It's a criminal act to go into court and lie. It's a criminal act to file a false charge. It's a criminal act to abuse your child. And limiting your child to one parent when there are two loving, nurturing parents available is child abuse.
There we go. Had a lump in my throat. Theryn and Karen, what got you guys involved in the men's movement?
You go first.
I didn't really have any personal thing at all, really. It wasn't anything that I witnessed going. I mean, like, I grew up in a family that was so normal that it's ridiculous. It would have made the most boring TV show ever. And it might have been on TV in the 50s, I don't know. But so I had this experience growing up, with two parents who were always treating each other with respect as equal partners, collaborating on decisions that affect the whole family, backing each other up, never allowing us kids to play both ends against the middle, as many kids do, particularly after divorce. So I had this life growing up, and then alongside this life, sort of parallel to it, was this narrative about men and women, right? It was everywhere. And I was just looking at it and I was going, like, that's just complete bullshit. Like, how do people believe this stuff, right? Now, I didn't realize how damaging, how much that narrative had gotten its hooks, because I was born in the 70s, right, when this had only been really going on for about 10 years, and hadn't gotten into the laws yet, really. I mean, there was all this informal bias. I mean, I'm sure men were being sentenced to 60% longer sentences than women back in the 50s, back in the 30s, right? But it wasn't sort of an openly talked about thing that men are awful, right? That men are horrible, until about the time when I was born. That started to become more and more and more pervasive. And given the men I knew, and, you know, growing up with mostly guy friends, and I mean, sometimes they were jerks, but, you know, but not always, and they were generally decent. And I mean, it struck me as completely false. It was just this completely false story about what's going on out there. And after I split up with my ex, I stumbled across a men's issues website, and it was pretty hardcore. I mean, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Voice for Men, but I mean, this was a Voice for Men on crack, right? The guys there, it was sort of a little bit pickup artisty, a little bit traditionalisty. They did talk a lot about, you know, rights, right, and legislative equality and things like that, and raising awareness. But they didn't pull any punches. And I stumbled in there, ironically, with a group of feminists onto that blog. I was writing dirty books at the time, and I was a member of this writers forum that was like just infested with feminists. And one of them said, "Hey, look at these idiots over here, let's go make fun of them," and left the link. And so I went over, and it was a kind of a ridiculous complaining story, right? It was, some guy was complaining that science fiction, you can't find hard science fiction anymore, you just can't. It's all been romanticized to appeal to women. It's just been feminized, blah, 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 right? So I'm reading through it, and I'm like, well, that's kind of a silly thing to complain about. And I'm reading through the comments, and one of the guys in the comments says, "Oh, well, the new Star Trek wasn't too bad. I totally ripped it off the internet and watched it 10 times, right?" And I'm sitting there looking at that, and then I was just like, I have to comment. I have to say something to this idiot. I was like, who would make a $320 million movie for an asshole like you who's just gonna steal it? At least your girlfriend will drag you to the theater, right? She'll buy you the Blu-ray, okay? So they all were like, she's right. And that was how I got started there. They just, I mean, I was really mean to this guy. I ripped a strip off of him, right? But the other guys there were like, you know what, she's right. That is kind of a dickbag move. And so essentially that's how, and then I got to talking to them, and they did not treat me nice because I was a girl. In fact, I had to prove that I wasn't going to expect special treatment before they started just relaxing. But talking with them, reading the articles on that website, reading about the Violence Against Women Act, reading about the Duluth model, reading about all of this stuff, reading about men's experiences of domestic violence, their experiences of sexual violence, and their experiences with society or the police or the courts when they actually, you know, reach out for some sort of help or mitigation. That was what really got me interested, because that made me ask the question, why, if this is all going on, why is this other upper layer of everything, you know, this women are wonderful, men are jerks? How is, like, why do we believe that, right? And then allow this all to go on and not pay any attention to it. So that's what really got me interested. And I guess I was just good enough at, you know, sort of presenting that, that it just snowballed, and I got more and more popular. And then I started getting emails from men who sort of said, "You're the reason I didn't commit suicide." And so I kind of felt like I had to continue doing it. So, yeah.
Yeah, mine's not as interesting and will probably not warrant an applause. I kind of got started, so I've always been interested in gender, or at least for a very long time. I never, like, I always knew that there were men's issues. Like, I was never so stupid to think that men are treated fairly all the time, throughout my whole life. But I started in university like 2 years ago. I started getting involved with campus activism, specifically like trans issues and whatnot. And then I realized what an absolute cesspool universities are. Because so here I was, and I was willing and ready to, for the first time in my life, really be an activist in terms of gender equality. But then I realized that my fellow activists, social justice activists, they weren't interested in their activism to include or consider the vulnerabilities of men, and really be about equality in that sense. And that didn't make sense to me. I didn't realize that was going to happen. I guess I was very naive at the time, but I didn't realize that they would not factor in men's issues when talking about trans issues, when talking about women's issues, when talking about gender equality and being on the forefront of gender activism. So I brought it up. Hateful. So I brought it up, and I was kind of being accused of being anti-feminist and misogynist.
They're synonymous, you know?
Oh, right, yeah. Yeah, they are. And so I got disillusioned and pissed off. And then I actually started watching Karen's videos, and then I had ideas of my own, and I became kind of obsessed and monomaniacal, and my boyfriend at the time started hating me because I just couldn't stop talking about all of this stuff. And at the time, he like identified as a feminist, and I think he actually at one point was minoring in gender studies. Luckily, I got him out of that, thank goodness. Yeah, so I was really, I'd had all these ideas, so I had to put it out, and so I started a YouTube channel, and I started talking about the issues, and people seemed to notice, and I'm still doing that, and yeah, so that's how it happened.
So you mentioned that you were accused of misogyny when you were part of the social justice circle jerk at SFU. So men's rights advocates are often accused of misogyny. So have you noticed any actual misogyny in the movement, and how does that compare to misandry or bigotry that you noticed when you were part of the aforementioned community?
Should I go first?
It was a direct question to you.
Oh, to me, okay. Okay. Have I noticed? It's hard. Like, I think there are misogynistic comments, but I always say, like, if it's some comment that just gets lost in the sea of comments and doesn't get a like or an affirmation, then it's just that idea doesn't get validation, which means, you know, the movement itself or those also kind of in the movement, if they're not validating the idea, then I can't really say the men's movement is misogynistic, but obviously there are like sexist comments here and there. I just haven't seen that kind of affirmation. Even someone like Paul Elam, who is like hated for being like a misogynist and anti-feminist, I did an interview with him, and he's like the sweetest person on earth. Like he's such a sweet person, and like we like communicate via email now, and we actually have kind of a relationship going, and he's such a good, cool person. So yeah, is there like of the sexism that I've seen that I wouldn't like? I don't like these terms because they seem to have been co-opted a little bit. But for example, I have been in the movement. People have assumed to think they know what I mean based on the fact that I'm a woman. Oh, you're a woman, therefore I know what you're actually trying to say. Because women have these ways of doing things and blah, 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 blah. So kind of judging people based on such an arbitrary characteristic such as their gender, I mean, that is kind of sexist. So yeah, I've gotten that, and I've mostly gotten that from, you're going to hate me, but like men going their own way. They've been the most. But having that said, I actually am a huge proponent of the MGTOW sect of the men's movement, and I've learned so much from them. But usually when people have that tone towards me, oh, yeah, you're a woman, so that's what you actually mean when you say that you're usually from that part of the movement. So yeah, there are some biases, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend like they're not there.
Okay, so we have a few questions from the live stream chat, and then after that we're going to jump into audience Q&A. So if anyone has questions, you can start heading down. So we had a few questions about the wage gap, so I'll try and kind of compile them into one question. How do you feel about the push for the wage gap as a discrimination issue, and do you feel that this influences people's ideas about men's issues and men's rights?
I actually hate the push for the wage gap. I call it the wage gap myth, because it is. It's a myth. There is not a gap in wages. There's an earnings gap. And then there's a slight gap that can't be accounted for that feminists call a gotcha moment. But if you cannot prove it's discrimination, what right do you have to assume it, when the vast majority of the rest of the so-called gap is provably not discrimination? And then even the federal government in the United States has its hands dirty in this. The government actually contracted research, and there was a report, the CONSAD report, that came out and demonstrated they could account for all but 7%. And this was a study of studies. There were like 50 different studies that they looked at. So there were 50 different sources of information, and they could not find evidence that there was this huge gap that was caused by discrimination. What they found was that men and women work differently. Men and women live differently. Women are more likely to choose a work-life balance so that they can spend more time with their children. Women are less likely to take jobs that have hazard pay. Women are less likely to take night shifts. Women are less likely to get that shift differential because of that. Women are less likely to take dirty, stinky jobs that you can only get a man to do. And generally you can only get a man to do if you pay him a lot of money to do it, or if he can't get a better job. And so there are areas of employment in which women choose to lose out on higher pay for better living conditions related to their jobs. And that's not necessarily wrong. That's not saying a bad thing about women. It's not that it means that women are less capable or women are lazy or women are less valuable or anything like that. But it does mean that it's not discrimination when they're not making as much money because they didn't make those choices. It doesn't mean that men don't deserve hazard pay when they climb a 1,000-foot pole, a 1,000-foot tower to change a light bulb. It doesn't mean that men don't deserve extra pay when they're going to be waist deep in raw sewage, or when they're working the night shift at a convenience store and taking a greater risk that somebody might come in with a gun and point it at them for whatever amount of money's in that cash register. These are things that nobody likes to consider in the wage gap discussion. And it is really unfair to both sexes to not acknowledge the details. I think it's very manipulative of politicians and political groups to try to use this myth to pit people against each other and to get laws passed that are nothing but an effort to get more government control over the employer-employee relationship. And women really should think long and hard about pushing this, because if women get this pushed through, it's not going to mean that women are just going to get more money without changing the way women are expected to work. It's going to change the way women are expected to work, and it's going to remove choices that women have if they're in a good enough situation. And I'm aware of this because I wasn't always. Because of the child support system and the way it's run, and how imputed income can be used to essentially impoverish a man after a divorce, I was the breadwinner of my family for several years. And because my husband was trying to improve his income so that he could actually have the income that the court said he had and be able to be a contributor to our household financially and still pay all of his child support, I also had to be the role that mothers usually are. So I had to take different jobs instead of trying to earn the way a man would earn. And it's a great deal harder to be the breadwinner of a family when you're trying to do so around a child's schedule and not just free to take that night job that doesn't end, that your shift doesn't end until after the kid's supposed to get on the school bus, when you have to be home during that time of day. And this is something that politicians and political groups do all the time. And it is a reason why when you hear about stuff like this, the buzzword wage gap is great as far as a propaganda tool. As soon as you say it, you've already said discrimination against women is happening and people buy it. You got to look past that. What are they really talking about? What's really going on? What are the dynamics? What needs to change? Does this need to be fixed? Is it really a broken thing? Do your research, because you cannot trust what either side of the discussion, is necessarily telling you without looking into it and making a decision for yourself.
I do want to say that the CONSAD report, the meta-analysis, one of the things that they noted, and this seems to be the case for every study that's done on the wage gap, is that there are some variables that we know are variables. And everybody here would agree that if you're willing to work overtime, if you're willing to stay on the weekend and finish that proposal, if you are willing to travel for work, right? That's going to affect your relative pay. You're going to get paid more. You're going to get your raises sooner, and you're also going to get promoted more often than somebody who just clocks out at 4:30 every single day and says, "Yeah, I'm done with all y'all." Okay, but that can't be quantified accurately enough to include in most of these studies what effect that has on pay. Another one is salary negotiations, right? They can't quite figure out how. They know that men are much more likely to negotiate their starting pay than women are, but they can't quite figure out exactly how much of an effect that has on aggregate incomes. So those are two of the things that could actually account for that 4 to 7% that currently isn't accounted for. And there is some evidence, there is actually some evidence that in some fields, women are discriminated against, right? But there's also equal evidence and possibly even better evidence that in some fields, men are discriminated against. Try being a dental hygienist as a man, right? Nobody, or a massage therapist, nobody wants a man in their personal space poking around at them, right? Both men and women would rather that person be a woman, right? And so maybe there's not a pay gap in those fields because the men just can't get the jobs to begin with, right? Primary school teaching, there's actually a pay gap in favor of men because men are made to feel so uncomfortable in the classrooms with small children that they end up actively seeking promotion into the school administration, right? Or they specialize a little bit more and they go on to teach high school instead, right? This is what, or there's a pay gap among men in schools as well because men are more likely to teach summer school than women are. And they should be paid for that. So those are some of the things that I think there is discrimination that goes on in the workplace. There absolutely is. Most of it, I think, is soft discrimination, not hard pay discrimination. Most people are paid according to scale and pay grade. Most people are paid the exact same starting wage. There was no male waiter where I worked who was getting more than minimum wage. Actually, less than minimum wage because in Alberta, servers get less than minimum wage. So, but yeah, no, and none of us ever, we get a raise when minimum wage goes up, right? That's just how that works. So, yeah, there's in the areas where it really counts, right? Where you have people who are really struggling to get by. They don't have careers, they have jobs, right? And they are not the elites. And so much of these kinds of problems that feminism brings up are really problems that only affect maybe the top 30% of society. If you're making sandwiches and serving donuts at Tim Hortons, you're going to get paid the same whether you're a man or a woman. You just are. People with jobs, right, that aren't glamorous and that don't have any kind of, and they don't have letters after their names, they're not the ones that this is really going to be affecting, that any of this possible discrimination going on is going to be affecting, so.
Yeah, I'm kind of tired of talking about the wage gap because it's...
Stupid?
Yeah, but what I rarely see, when the wage gap is discussed, I rarely see it being discussed from the other side. Maybe men work a little too hard. Maybe they don't have a balanced enough life and they don't have enough time to form a social network. Maybe this whole wage gap that indicates men earning more isn't necessarily a good thing for men. Because I do see the men in my life not having really close friends, like my father. He's such a hardworking man, but he doesn't have he doesn't have this social network on which he can fall back. And I would speculate and go so far as to say that may be a factor in why men commit suicide, because they don't feel like they have anywhere to go. So, yeah. We can talk about it from that angle as well. And just men generally taking care of themselves a little bit better. I have a family friend now who, also very hardworking doctor, never really, thought much of his own health. And now because they didn't catch it early enough, he has terminal cancer in the brain. And it's really sad because if they just got it a few months earlier, he could have still had a lot more years ahead of him. So yeah, these are big things that I see when I look at the wage gap.